The glass shattered across the marble floor, but I did not flinch. His face froze in disbelief, a mixture of anger and fear twisting his sharp features. For years, I had held his secret close, cherished it even, a delicate thread binding him to me. And now, here in the grand hall of his mansion, that same secret screamed louder than any voice ever could. I watched as my best friend, Sophie, stumbled back, eyes wide, the color draining from her face. She had always thought I was loyal, naive, innocent even. She never suspected that I knew him the way I did, that I had known him intimately, and that I held the power to strip him of his pride, his respect, his carefully curated image of control. Every whispered lie, every staged act of affection, every carefully guarded truth was about to unravel. And when it did, Sophie would see me not as the naive girl she once laughed with, but as the one who had quietly watched, waited, and ultimately struck. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but I already held the leverage. The family he cherished, the reputation he groomed, the trust Sophie had placed in him, all of it balanced on the fragile edge of my control. And I was ready to push. My name is Lillian Harper, and I was 28 when I became entangled in a web I never intended to enter. Sophie and I had been inseparable since childhood. We shared secrets, birthdays, dreams, and even heartbreaks. Her father, Gregory Winthrop, was always a looming presence, the stern patriarch of a family whose wealth and influence seemed untouchable. He had that quiet authority that drew people to him, yet behind closed doors, he had weaknesses few could perceive. I had stumbled into one of them accidentally, and then willingly, drawn by curiosity, loneliness, and something I barely understood at the time. Our interactions began innocently, a fleeting conversation here, a secret smile there. But they escalated into something forbidden, something dangerous. And as I discovered, holding his secret gave me a power I never expected. A power I would learn to wield when betrayal struck in the form of my best friend. I grew up in a small town just a few miles from the sprawling Winthrop estate. My parents were hardworking, ordinary people who instilled in me a sense of integrity, humility, and perseverance. I had always been the quiet observer, the one who listened more than spoke, who noticed the tiny shifts in people's expressions and words. Sophie, in contrast, was vibrant and outspoken, a force of energy that drew attention effortlessly. Our friendship had begun in elementary school when she had helped me after I fell in the playground, and it had blossomed over the years into a bond that felt unbreakable. We shared everything, or so I thought. Her father, Gregory, was the kind of man who commanded respect simply by entering a room. He was sharp, articulate, and seemingly untouchable. I first met him at one of Sophie's family gatherings when I was 18. He had smiled politely at me, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. At the time, I dismissed it as curiosity, but there was an intensity there, a subtle pull I could not name. Over the years, our paths crossed more frequently at school events, neighborhood gatherings, and charity functions. He would speak to me casually, offering compliments and attention that felt unusual for someone of his stature. The turning point came when Sophie had gone away for a week-long trip. Gregory had invited me over to help with some minor errands at the house. We spoke for hours, first about Sophie, then about work, then about life in general. His gaze held mine longer than necessary, his tone shifting in ways that made my pulse quicken. I left that day confused, a mix of guilt and curiosity gnawing at me. Within weeks, what had been a casual acquaintance transformed into secret meetings, quiet conversations, and fleeting touches that I tried and failed to rationalize. I was young, impressionable, and flattered, but I also understood that what we were doing was dangerous. The secrecy became part of the allure, each stolen moment feeling simultaneously thrilling and wrong. Despite my growing awareness of the moral lines we were crossing, I convinced myself that I was careful, discreet, and untouchable. Gregory, for his part, remained calm, measured, never letting his guard down in public. He was a man who wore two faces, the respected patriarch and the flawed, vulnerable human who confided in me. Over the years, our secret continued, hidden beneath the polished surface of dinners, outings, and social events. I became a confidant, a keeper of secrets that would have destroyed many marriages, many friendships, and many lives if revealed. Sophie, oblivious to the truth, spoke of her father with admiration, trust, and love. She confided in me about her own romantic failures, her fears, and ambitions. I played the part of loyal friend flawlessly, suppressing guilt, shame, and the growing sense of power that came from knowing something so intimate about her family. There were times I questioned my choices, times I felt a pang of regret and fear. Yet the pull, the intensity, the dangerous thrill of it all kept me entangled. I told myself that I was careful, that I had boundaries, that nothing could ever slip into the open. I was young, clever, and utterly certain I could navigate the storm. But life has a way of appending even the most carefully laid plans. Sophie began a serious relationship, and I started noticing subtle changes in Gregory, impatience, frustration, and quiet anger that was misplaced, yet unmistakable. The delicate balance we had maintained began to strain, though I could not yet see that the true storm was on the horizon. It all unraveled the evening Sophie returned from her trip. I had been invited to dinner at the Winthrop estate, the air heavy with the scent of roses and polished wood. Gregory greeted me with his usual controlled warmth, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the hallway where Sophie's laughter soon echoed. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as she appeared, radiant and unsuspecting, completely unaware of the invisible threads connecting the three of us. Dinner began with small talk, Sophie recounting her adventures, her energy filling the room as Gregory nodded, listening, his jaw tight. I sensed a tension in the air, a subtle undercurrent that whispered of things unspoken. Then Sophie casually mentioned her plans for a summer internship and her excitement about growing more independent. Gregory's face changed, the slight twitch in his mouth betraying irritation. He tried to mask it, but it was there, undeniable. Sophie laughed at something I said, and for a moment, I glimpsed the man I had known in secret, frustrated, restless, and vulnerable. It startled me, reminded me of the power I held, but I pushed the thought aside. Later, as we moved to the drawing room, Sophie excused herself to take a call, leaving Gregory and me alone. The air shifted immediately. He spoke softly, leaning closer, a hand brushing mine just enough to send a shock through me. I knew then that the delicate balance we had maintained was on the verge of collapse. He whispered a request, a subtle demand that I had never anticipated, that I could not refuse without exposing myself. In that instant, I realized our secret, once carefully contained, had the potential to destroy everything: Sophie's trust, his reputation, and the image of my own integrity. My mind raced, heart pounding, as I promised myself silently that if this secret ever threatened me or Sophie, I would wield it like a weapon, not merely a shield. The evening ended with laughter, a facade of normalcy, yet the tension lingered, unspoken but tangible. I left the mansion that night with a growing certainty that betrayal, when it arrived, would come not from me, but from the very people I had sought to protect. Within days, the evidence of that betrayal would manifest in ways I could not have predicted, forcing me to confront a choice between silence and decisive action, between loyalty and survival. The first stage began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow creep of a shadow across a sunlit room. Sophie confided in me about her father's increasingly unpredictable behavior, mentioning the subtle changes that had started to unsettle her. She described his abrupt silences, the way he would leave rooms mid-conversation, the unusual phone calls that ended whenever she entered the room. She laughed nervously about it, thinking it was merely the quirks of an aging man, but I felt the tension tighten inside me. I could hear in her voice the faint tremor of anxiety she refused to acknowledge, and I realized that the secret I carried, the one so perilous and forbidden, gave me a vantage point she could never imagine. I had been Gregory's secret, a hidden piece of his world, yet now I had become a silent observer of the unraveling threads he had no awareness I could see. Every confession he had made, every vulnerable slip, every misstep now felt like a weapon at my disposal. I began cataloging these moments in my mind, not maliciously, but with a careful patience that only grew as I watched him grow more careless. As Sophie spoke, I offered her comfort, words carefully measured to sound empathetic and concerned, while internally I mapped the pathways of power, influence, and leverage. At night, alone in my apartment, I replayed every detail of Gregory's words, every fleeting touch, every sigh, storing them in memory for the day when they could serve as ammunition. It was in this quiet, almost obsessive attention to detail that I recognized the potential for a reckoning, a poetic justice that would require neither force nor exposure, only patience and timing. The second stage of escalation became more pronounced as Gregory himself grew bolder in his recklessness. He no longer hesitated to make subtle gestures, touches that lingered just long enough to remind me of our secret without acknowledgement. He assumed I would never betray him, that our arrangement would remain contained and invisible to the outside world. This arrogance fueled my growing awareness that I held the advantage, and I began to push the boundaries gently, a question here, a comment there, designed to test his reactions. Each misstep, each careless whisper, became a brick in the foundation of the revenge that would one day be complete. Sophie, meanwhile, continued to confide in me about her own experiences and frustrations, unaware that I was intricately linked to the very source of her discomfort. She mentioned incidents at school, at work, and in her social life where her father's influence seemed overbearing or manipulative, and I listened with feigned concern, nodding, offering reassurance, all the while mentally intertwining these accounts with the secret knowledge I held. I could see Gregory's frustration grow, his subtle impatience, the ways he tried to mask his agitation with charm and laughter, each gesture leaving traces of weakness that I catalogued silently. During this time, I began to influence the dynamics between father and daughter, strategically planting suggestions and ideas, nudging Sophie's perceptions in subtle ways, never revealing my role, yet slowly steering events toward a tipping point. I noticed the delicate balance of power shifting, a tension that tightened like a rope, ready to snap. The third stage was the most dangerous, the most intricate, because it involved not just observation but calculated manipulation. Gregory's arrogance reached a peak. He began to treat me as a confidant in full view of Sophie, revealing plans and frustrations with reckless abandon, convinced that the walls of secrecy protected him. He underestimated my patience and vigilance, unaware that I had transformed my fear and desire into a meticulous plan. One evening, during a family gathering at the Winthrop estate, Sophie's friends were present and Gregory became unguarded, making comments and jokes that skirted the edges of impropriety, thinking them harmless or charming. I allowed Sophie to overhear just enough, her eyes narrowing in confusion and discomfort, while I maintained a composed demeanor, as if I were merely an observer of an ordinary, imperfect family. The tension was palpable, a silent storm brewing in the room. That night, I left the gathering with my mind fully occupied with the possibilities, every interaction carefully analyzed, every reaction noted for the day when my patience would culminate in action. As weeks passed, the strain between father and daughter intensified. Sophie grew increasingly skeptical of Gregory's explanations, confused by contradictions in his stories, and sought my guidance more frequently. I provided advice, subtle encouragement to question and explore, never revealing my own entanglement, yet I carefully orchestrated circumstances so that the inconsistencies he left behind became undeniable in her perception. Each encounter, each revelation, built upon the last, and I began to see the framework of the revenge I would soon execute. I knew that patience was my greatest ally, that timing would make the humiliation complete and undeniable. The final days before the confrontation were tense, a delicate dance between observation and subtle intervention. Gregory's behavior became erratic, his confidence turning to frustration, frustration turning to anger, and his arrogance ensured that he made missteps I could exploit. I carefully recorded these moments, storing them mentally and physically where needed, preparing for the day when Sophie would finally see the truth without doubt or question. The escalation had achieved its purpose. Gregory had become careless, Sophie had grown alert and suspicious, and I had positioned myself perfectly between the two, holding the knowledge, the leverage, and the patience to act decisively. Every whispered secret, every misjudged glance, every attempt to manipulate had contributed to a moment where justice could be served, where the scales could finally be balanced. I felt the thrill of anticipation, but it was tempered by the calm awareness that the execution required precision, timing, and control. In that state, I understood that revenge was not about anger or impulse, but about clarity, strategy, and patience, and the moment was approaching when all that I had observed, endured, and planned would converge into a single, undeniable act of poetic justice. The day of reckoning arrived with the quiet inevitability of a storm. I had arranged everything meticulously, knowing that each detail, each subtle manipulation, would converge to reveal the truth in a way Gregory could neither deny nor escape. Sophie had begun to sense the discrepancies for herself, questions lingering in her eyes whenever she looked at her father, and I knew the moment was ripe. I invited them both to the gallery where Gregory had hosted one of his art exhibitions, a place he took pride in, where the walls bore the weight of his name and influence. The setting itself would amplify the impact. The room was elegant, the lighting soft, shadows cast along every canvas, and it would be the stage for exposure, for the unveiling of secrets he believed buried. I greeted them warmly, my voice calm and steady, concealing the pulse of anticipation that raced beneath my skin. As the evening progressed, I allowed conversation to flow naturally, making careful observations, noting the subtle signs of Gregory's complacency. He laughed easily, oblivious to the trap, and Sophie lingered near me, her curiosity growing, her instincts nudging her closer to questions she had not yet formed aloud. I waited until the room was filled with a select few who held no knowledge of the truth, but whose presence added a sense of gravity, witnesses who would later understand the magnitude of what would unfold. Then, with the precision I had rehearsed countless times in my mind, I guided the conversation, leading Gregory to recount the story of the acquisition of a particular painting, the details slipping from his lips exactly as I had anticipated. I smiled faintly, encouraging him, nodding, feigning admiration, while Sophie's attention sharpened, her eyes following his every movement. At the precise moment, I introduced a series of photographs and documents I had kept hidden, artifacts that chronicled months of indiscretions, whispered meetings, and intimate correspondence. I revealed them slowly, deliberately, ensuring that Gregory's shock would be visible, that his facade would crumble in real time. The room grew tense, the air heavy with unspoken realization, and I watched as his eyes darted between me, the proof, and his daughter, who had now pieced together what I had long known, the truth of my relationship with him. Sophie's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, then to hurt, and finally to understanding. I spoke carefully, explaining the context, the manipulation, the secrecy, all without accusation, allowing the evidence to speak louder than words. Gregory's attempts to justify himself, to charm and excuse, faltered and fell flat, every explanation undermined by the undeniable reality displayed before him. He realized, with growing horror, that the world he had controlled so carefully was unraveling, that his influence, his authority, and his arrogance had all been meticulously exposed. The audience of witnesses absorbed the scene in stunned silence, their whispers carrying through the gallery like the faint echo of a verdict. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm, confronting her father with the betrayal she now fully comprehended, the hypocrisy and the lies that had shaped her perception of him. I remained calm, my presence a silent anchor, knowing that my role had been to orchestrate, to reveal, not to speak for her. Gregory's composure shattered completely, the carefully constructed image of power and respectability collapsing under the weight of truth. He tried to retreat, to explain, to charm, but every word rang hollow, every gesture exposed as desperate. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, the complexity of emotions that comes from being both avenger and participant, both harmed and empowered. In that moment, I understood the full measure of patience, strategy, and timing, how the smallest observations, the quietest attentions, could culminate in the most profound form of justice. The evening ended with Gregory silent, defeated, and Sophie turning toward me with eyes that now held a cautious understanding, a recognition of the intricate balance of betrayal and revelation. The revenge was complete, not through force or malice, but through careful orchestration, through the patient accumulation of evidence, insight, and observation that allowed the truth to shine undeniably, irreversibly, and publicly. In the weeks that followed the revelation, life unfolded in ways I had scarcely imagined, both heavier and freer at the same time. Sophie avoided her father for a while, though not with anger, more with a quiet need to understand, to process the layers of betrayal she had uncovered. Our relationship, once strained by secrecy and guilt, began to take a different shape, not one of friendship untouched, but one of cautious respect and honesty. Gregory withdrew, not from shame alone, though that was part of it, but from the understanding that his carefully curated image had dissolved and that he could no longer manipulate the world around him without scrutiny. The gallery where the confrontation had taken place became a symbol for me, a reminder that truth, when exposed deliberately and patiently, holds a power that cannot be undone. I returned there alone one afternoon, walking the familiar halls, feeling the faint echo of the evening where control shifted, where deception was laid bare. The quiet of the space reminded me that revenge is not always about loud confrontations or dramatic gestures, but often about observation, timing, and the courage to let the truth emerge in its own undeniable force. I reflected on my own choices, the years I had spent balancing affection, secrecy, and moral compromise, and I realized that I had been shaped not only by betrayal, but also by the careful lessons it taught me. There was sorrow, certainly, for the innocence lost, for the relationships that could never return to their previous simplicity, yet there was also a profound sense of liberation, a recognition that I had reclaimed control over my narrative. Life resumed with new rhythms, new priorities, and a deeper understanding of human complexity. Sophie and I began to rebuild trust in measured ways, conversations flowing with honesty rather than omission, each exchange a step toward a bond that could survive the shadows of past deceptions. Gregory, on the other hand, faced consequences that were not externally imposed, but internally realized. His pride, his illusions, and his authority had been irrevocably undermined. I found a quiet satisfaction in observing the natural course of justice, in witnessing the inevitable outcome of recklessness and selfishness. And yet, I also understood that revenge alone is not the ultimate goal. It is clarity, truth, and self-preservation that matter most. As I walked through the gallery one last time, I asked myself silently what I had truly gained, and I recognized that it was more than vindication. It was wisdom, resilience, and the unshakable certainty that life can be redirected when one possesses patience and courage. And I wondered quietly, not with bitterness, but with reflection, how many of us wait too long, too passively, to confront deception, to reclaim our lives, and to let truth speak in the way it must. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments.